Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. It's 2026 and I've already seen a bunch of movies this year. I actually started this year with a cold, so my writing has been a bit slower than usual, but on the plus side, that did give me the chance to just go see a lot of movies during the day when no one's there. And the first one that I saw, actually I'm going to talk about one that I saw on Netflix recently, which is The Rip with Matt Damon and Ben Affleck.
Damn. I bought 14 more of those things at least. That's a $20 million rip.
I wanted to talk about this one because I thought it was an interesting example of a movie with quite a bit of potential and that is still surprisingly good, surprisingly engaging, but which also feels kind of run through the Netflix machine and has some particular diminishments because of that. So this is based on a true story apparently, but it's about this group of cops who go to like drug money stashes and rip them. That's where the title comes from. Anyways, they have this tip of a stash. They are expecting to find like 150,000 or maybe 300,000. It's a bit unclear at the beginning, and purposefully so. But when they get there, it turns out there's like 20 million there. So there's a lot of alarm bells that start going off. There's a lot of distrust that arises or emerges within the group itself as the individual cops are, they get a little bit of sense of greed coming up, but also a sense of fear because they, with this big of a stash, someone's gonna miss it. And of course, sooner than later, they get like a phone call, they start getting threatened, and you can feel like there's enemies circling all around them, and the walls start closing in on them.
Hello?
You have 30 minutes to get the fuck out of that house. Just do your job and take the money that's supposed to be there.
And I think that immediately captures what I thought was the most well done aspect of this movie. It's really got this sense of dread that arises from these characters being in this confined location, which is not at all secure. It's kind of like this rundown house. There's just one woman living there. And, the first thing that's on their mind is, okay, we gotta make this place secure. And it's just that sense of dread and anxiety that just gets bigger and bigger that I thought was really well done. And that really had me hooked, like, oh, what's gonna happen? When are the enemies coming in, and what's going to happen within the group itself? Who's going to turn on who's going to break, who's going to stay moral, all that stuff. That's what I thought was really, really great.
What's going on, fellas?
Visually speaking, I thought it was fine, not as bad as some people make it out to be, but it definitely is one of those movies where you can feel like there's a lot of Netflix sort of gloss where there should be more like grease, if that makes sense. It's one of those movies where you can just tell, like, if this was made back in the 80s by someone like John Carpenter, it would be a lot more gritty and raw and just a little bit more real than it is now, where there's a lot of situations where you can sort of see past the illusion of the story and get a sense of like, oh, there's a studio light there, or this is like a set, or like this is a designed element. And that was a bit of a shame to me because I do feel like the main cast was well enough to kind of sell the story itself and to sell this world, in which you have these kind of hard-edged cops going through these houses to find drug money. But the real issue where I think you can most clearly feel the sort of hand of Netflix hovering over and like touching, fumbling this thing is the way the story is told, basically. And I think Matt Damon and Ben Affleck have even talked about this in a recent interview. I think they were on the Joe Rogan podcast, where they talked about Netflix movies being a lot more repetitive when it comes to the exposition. So a lot of facts about the story, a lot of exposition or information about the story is repeated multiple times for the sake of an audience that's sitting on the couch. Maybe they're on the phone or they're in the kitchen or somewhere, and they want to stay engaged, or they want to stay in the loop, but they don't want to pay full attention. So and that's something you see in this movie as well, where the script does have those moments of awkward exposition and things being the same information being repeated over and over again. And it just takes away from that kind of grittiness that you want in a story like this. Most transgressively, however, for me is the movie's ending. I thought there's a great sort of climax. You have this build-up, there's the tension in the house, which ultimately culminates into this confrontation that becomes this big action set piece, and then there's like this grand reveal. You know, it's not like a plot twist or anything, I would say, maybe a little bit. I don't want to spoil it here, but you know, there's a point in the story, a very clear point in the story, about 90 minutes in, I think, where all is revealed, everything comes together, and it's very satisfying and actually just really well done in a way that I thought like, oh, this was great, and I actually really enjoyed this. And you know, I would give this maybe even like 4 stars out of 5. But then I checked the runtime real quick, and I saw that there were still like 25 minutes to go. And from there on, like, again, there's a point where the story can basically wrap up, but then the bad guys, who I won't reveal here, they make a dash for it, like a very unrealistic moment of escape, which then prompts another even bigger action set piece, which just completely overstays its welcome, because narratively, you know, everything has already been sort of wrapped up and you're kind of ready to end the story. But then, oh no, you just gotta watch this kind of pointless action chase scene for another, like it goes on for another good like 15 minutes or so, and then there's like more wrap up, which you know, it is to be expected in a movie like this, but it just so clearly feels like they demanded more action or like a bigger set piece finale at the end of it, even though it just can be cut out almost completely without losing all that much. And yeah, I don't know, that's why the movie just kind of lost me. My attention just was out of it completely. And so on Letterboxd, I think I ended up giving it 3 stars instead of 4, just because Netflix spoiled it a little bit for me. But still, as far as Netflix originals go, I think this was still one of the better ones. It's definitely worth watching. It has some great performances, a solid soundtrack beneath it, and some great tension throughout most of it, I would say.
Old Nick released his demons unto the world of man, and the world of man fell before the demons.
I also watched The Bone Temple, the sequel to 28 Years Later, which I also actually really enjoyed. I was kind of struggling at first with getting a sense of what this movie is about. We basically have these 2 parallel storylines where you have Ian Kelso, the Ray Fiennes character from the first movie, the doctor in the titular Bone Temple, who develops this relation, or I guess we can call it a relation, with Samson, which was that big alpha zombie from the first movie. And there's the idea that he might be finding a cure for the zombie condition, basically. And then there's the other storyline that follows Spike from the first movie, who is now with the Jimmy gang, which was also teased at the end of the first movie.
Let's be pals.
And who's basically becomes trapped in this very toxic, cult-like group under the command of the main Jimmy, who's played by, I'm blanking on his name, Jack O'Connell, who's very, very great in this movie. So you have these 2 parallel storylines, and they intersect at the end, at the climax of the movie, in a way that I thought was very interesting, and that also sort of retroactively reveals kind of the themes that this movie deals with, which is very much, at least in my experience, it was a kind of about hell and about demons and false prophets, which is also like a recurring theme for writer Alex Garland, who wrote this movie. And from that perspective, I kind of liked the idea of having these 2 storylines where you have an basically innocent soul in the form of Spike, who's kind of circling hell, while in the other storyline you have this literal demon who's being brought out of it. And I thought that was an interesting sort of dichotomy, and even if I'm not sure like what the movie is trying to say exactly, you know, I don't think this is the kind of movie that really has like a very specific like didactic theme or message that it wants to convey. It's just kind of a reflection on a part of the human condition in the face of a world that is very chaotic and uncertain, and where people are searching for like meaning or just something to hold on to, and which can lead them astray into what is basically this kind of hellish behavior or this hellish environment. There is a part of me that did miss the direction from Danny Boyle, who didn't come to return the sequel, because I did feel like the first 28 years later was just such a fascinating piece of work, also stylistically and presentation-wise, with a lot of the stock footage that was blended in, the art, musical choices, and that was kind of missing in this second one, which had a different director. But I like the way she did add more intimacy to the story, and you know, she goes for something a little bit more grounded and almost meditative in some aspects, or in some moments where you have, especially with the doctor and zombie storyline, there was a lot of moments of kind of unspoken interactions and quiet moments where you can see the zombie sort of being brought back from hell just by the close-ups on his face and his eyes, and I thought that was really well done. And in the other storyline too, I think the director did a great job at just emphasizing the sheer evilness of the Jimmy gang. And there's one scene in particular, a sequence quite early on in a barn, that was just one of the most horrifying things I'd seen in a long time. And for me, you know, this is what true horror is about. You know, it's not about characters sneaking around being scared by jump scares or weird noises, but it's just like the way you can capture just the sheer presence of evil. And I think that to me is always something that's a lot more scary than anything that just jumps out of the bushes somewhere. And that's what this movie captures really well. You know, again, Jack O'Donnell's his character, he's truly like vile and psychotic and deranged in a way that just makes you imagine being in a situation where you have to confront him or have to navigate an interaction with him, and then all the while getting that sense of like one misstep and you're just going to be subjected to the most horrifying fate that you can imagine. And that's, you know, it's that particular type of sort of human horror, I'd say, that to me is always more scary than any monster or ghost or whatever. And in that sense, I did feel like this movie was a lot scarier and a lot more unsettling than the first one, which mostly deals with the non-human enemies or non-human dangers of the zombies. So yeah, overall, I'm not sure how I'd rank this one compared to the first. I did feel like on first impression that they were definitely on par, even though they both have their the specific things they emphasize on, both in terms of presentation and style, and as well as in, you know, storytelling and themes. So overall, yeah, I was very happy with this one. I was very glad to see it wasn't just a lesser retreading of the first movie, but that it really was a continuation that tried to explore different angles and different story paths, and that in doing so has become like a nice, you know, just a proper sequel to the first one.
Would you like to see what you're getting yourself into?
Okay, next up is The Housemaid, starring Sydney Sweeney and Amanda Seyfried. I went into this movie not knowing anything about it. I just went in completely blind. I hadn't seen any of the trailers. I didn't even really know the premise of it. And, you know, I said on Letterboxd, there's like a 7 out of 10 psychological thriller here with solid tension and some fun twists and turns, but one that is also interspersed with moments of just pure 2 out of 10 50 Shades slop, including some of the worst needle drops in recent memory, and also a kind of a bonkers ending. And I think that still captures it pretty succinctly, you know. It started out genuinely interesting, where you have Sydney Sweeney's character who applies to be a housemaid at the house of Amanda Seyfried's character, who is this really rich, wealthy woman with a young daughter and a very pretty, perfect husband, who's very successful. And, you know, there's a twist kind of right after the prologue, so not exactly a twist where you find out that Sydney Sweeney's character, Millie, I think was her name. Millie. So basically what we learn in the first 5 or 10 minutes or so, once she's accepted into this position, is that Millie is actually an ex-convict who's been struggling to make a living, and she's been sleeping basically in her car. And so she's just kind of lied her way into this position, and that immediately forms like the first sort of bomb underneath the table. But what then happens is that Nina, who's the wealthy woman played by Amanda Seyfried, you also quickly get the sense that there's something a little off about her. You know, she has these intense mood swings and, you know, kind of like a bipolar personality, which causes a lot of friction in the house. And, you know, her husband at some point also starts to get like a sense of it, and he takes, he becomes sympathetic also towards Millie, as, you know, Nina starts kind of brutalizing Millie a little bit. And, you know, there's some tension there between the husband and Millie, which then of course escalates into a romantic affair. And that's where the movie becomes really, really strange for me, at least. That's where it starts being like 50 Shades-esque, with like a bunch of like needle drops, you know, Lana Del Rey. It just becomes like very sloppy. And I use that word very specifically because it is genuinely sloppy and just a complete tonal break with the first 30 minutes or so. And I don't know, I just kind of felt bamboozled a little bit. Like, was I just tricked into seeing like what looked like an interesting psychological thriller? Is it just going to be like this sappy romantic story? But fortunately, to the movie's credit, it does get more interesting in the later half, where there's like other revelations that come to the foreground, or that are just revealed, and which add like new layers of tension and new conflicts. And that's where the movie started getting a little bit more interesting for me again. And, you know, to be fair, what I will say about this movie is that it is engaging from beginning to end, you know, with the weird stylistic choices and all included. But yeah, then just as I thought it was back on track, you know, it does have the very ending, you know, not like the actual climax, but the sort of button at the very end of it. There's like a little stinger at the end. That's also like a very weird one that is apparently setting up a sequel, which I didn't know, but I don't know. It doesn't feel like the kind of movie that needs a sequel, but apparently they're gonna make one. So I guess we'll see where that goes. But it's not a good ending. It's not a good, strange ending in the way that 28 years later also had a very strange and jarring ending. It's just kind of a baffling one in the context of the story that just preceded it. I'm not going to spoil it here, but or actually I might. I'll do a little spoiler marker in the description. So spoilers coming in. So, you know, in the end, it's revealed that the husband was actually the evil guy, and Millie ends up killing him, and she's then hired by this other wealthy woman who's also clearly being abused by her husband, with the sort of wink that Millie is the kind of person who knows how to handle situations like these, as if she's now going to be a professional husband killer, that's going to be her job. I don't know. It felt really ridiculous in a kind of like the kind of stuff you'd see in an Avengers movie, but not in a very more or less serious psychological thriller where, you know, this kind of trauma is taken seriously by the story itself. So yeah, that to me just was kind of ridiculous. Yeah.
What is that? The storm?
No, that's not a storm.
Allison! I wanted something!
Okay, so the last movie I saw was Greenland 2 Migration, starring Gerald Butler. I'd seen the first one. I remember enjoying the first one. I don't remember anything about it really. I remember it being this disaster movie where people had to flee to a bunker in Greenland, which is also where this second movie begins. So with that limited information, I did feel like I have enough to jump into this one. So there has been this global cataclysmic weather event or climate event, and most of the Earth is now inhabitable except for this bunker in Greenland, which is where the story begins. And I thought this was an interesting premise, and I really enjoyed the first 10 minutes or so, where you kind of have this life in the bunker. You get to see a slice of life from what existence looks like for these characters, and you have this great sequence where Gerald Butler has to go out into the surface to scavenge for stuff along the coast, and it's this really cool, almost Death Stranding-like sequence where he's just all alone in this rugged landscape and, in this fallen world. And it's very moody and interesting. And then it just kind of becomes more formulaic again, I'd say. To the movie's credit, I do think that Gerald Butler is a great actor, and he's very capable of carrying a movie, and he's pretty much the guy who pulled me through this. He just has a very compelling screen presence, as a classic leading man who's very good at just playing like some guy. He doesn't look all beefed up as most actors are, or even as he himself was for back in the 300 days. He looks like kind of like gruff and a little greasy, a little dirty, in a way that just makes him more convincing as just this average Joe, which I really enjoyed. And it's just the kind of actors that we don't really have enough of anymore. But unfortunately, he isn't given too much to work with. He's just mostly kind of like the sad guy who wants to protect his family. And, along the way, he's from the beginning of the movie, he's like coughing, and you get the sense like, oh, there's something wrong with him. He might not have too long to live, which, minor spoiler, he doesn't. He's sick with radiation sickness or something. And it just casts like a very dreary blanket over a movie that's already kind of sad and bleak, and that doesn't have much in the way of fun going on. And I don't mean like lighthearted humor, but just like stuff that's, stuff that just isn't overly self-serious, because that's not what you want in a big disaster movie. Even the best disaster movies, they have like some elements of lightheartedness going on, or some sense of wonder, or at least some sense of awe for the scale of the destruction. And even that is not much. There isn't much going on here, because the big disaster has already happened, and there's like still remnants of it. There's a meteor shower that kills a guy, and there's a flood that happens at the beginning with an earthquake, but it's all, it just doesn't look as good even as it did like 15 years ago. But that aside, I guess my main problem is that this movie kind of sets itself up as this very typical post-apocalyptic road trip movie. At the beginning of the movie, the bunker is destroyed by some kind of earthquake/tsunami event, and then they have to make way for another promised place of exile where there's still safety and security. And so that's where the titular migration begins. But they very quickly take that sort of refreshing premise where you have this whole society in a bunker, and they quickly kill off like 99% of them to just kind of center back on one family who's going on this journey. And along the way, as is usual, you get these various obstacles in the way. And, I said in my review on Letterboxd, it's just a tedious and dreary collection of the genre tropes. There's the marauders, there's the military enclave, and there's the one scene with the empathetic family for like a kind of a down moment where you can remember the humanity that's lost in the outside world. It's just so formulaic, which was a shame considering how the premise did start in a place that could have been something more unique. But no, instead you just have these very familiar, tired story beats, and none of them are engaging on like any deeper level. There's one scene, for example, where they just have to cross like this ravine on a ladder, and then they're on the ladder, but there's like a hard wind that starts blowing and they almost fall off, and it's just, there's nothing in the sense of like moral conflict going on. There's nothing in a sort of, nothing that reveals anything deeper about these characters or about humanity in general. It's just the most surface layer of obstacles that are just thrown at them again and again, and it's, I just wish they'd come up with something a little bit more creative, anything really. Because given what it is now, I just couldn't really recommend this one, As much as there are like some interesting world building aspects happening in the periphery of the story, which you of course don't get to see much of in a direct sense. The place that they're going is the actual place of the impact of the meteor that set the events in the first movie in action. Or I guess it was I forgot it was a meteor that did that, not just like a climate or weather event. But anyways, in the crater that meteor created, there's now supposed to be this sort of land before time like green valley where everyone lives in harmony, which is kind of strange because at the same time around them, like the surviving nations are also supposedly at war with each other for the access to that green valley, but the green valley itself is just perfectly fine and safe and happy place to be. And so yeah, I liked the idea of surviving nations going at war with each other or being in conflict for each other for the last sort of remaining scrap of viable Earth. But again, the movie just kind of detours through that completely because it has to stay focused on the one family. Also clearly like a budget issue, like a lot of the obstacles are sort of designed to not need a lot of big sets or like a lot of extras and that sort of stuff. So it does feel like a kind of a small movie, which is also something that you don't really want to see in a big disaster movie. So yeah, all in all, even with my standards lowered, because I know I wasn't going to see like a great masterpiece here, I was still a little bit disappointed. I at least wanted to have like more fun with a good like Gerald Butler flick, and which he does, I think, mostly delivers on. I think Plane was a very fascinating, or at least just a very entertaining one that he did recently. I liked the first Greenland movie, but this one, I don't know. It just didn't do anything for me. So yeah, that's what I've been able to see here so far. Let me know your thoughts on these movies. I should be having a main video out soon on the main channel, which is about masculinity and as depicted in movies directed by women. So I'm kind of looking at the idea of movies directed about a gender by someone of a different gender, and which will mostly be focusing on Claire Denis, her excellent film Boat Travail. So yeah, I have that one coming up very soon. After that, I'm gonna do another director profile that I've been really looking forward to. I'm not yet gonna reveal who it is, but it's gonna be a very unexpected one, I think, and it's gonna be a lot of fun. So be sure to subscribe to the main channel or this channel if you haven't already. I'm gonna do more stuff on this channel as well, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.